Hello, welcome to The Inclusive. This is Faria, and you're watching The Inclusive International. Climate change is playing havoc with the lives of people, influencing the most important facets of life like water and food accessibility. We are joined by Waiza Rafique of Capacity Building Research and Development Circle. Waiza, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Faria. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Waiza, tell us about the campaigning and research you have been doing recently, and tell us about the impact that it's making in different parts of Pakistan. You were telling me that you're getting a very good response from all provinces of Pakistan.
Yes, thank you so much. So, first time when we talked about the connection between climate change and human rights, people were mostly surprised that climate change, how is it connected with human rights, and what nexus exists between the idea of climate change or between the phenomena of climate change and human rights. But when we try to talk and spread awareness about how closely the issue of climate change is connected with human rights of people and how climate change and the impacts of climate change are influencing human rights, for instance, right to life, right to education, right to gender equality, right to free trade and movement and freedom of religion and expression, and so many other rights that we term as fundamental rights or human rights. So, when we talked about this connection and the influence that climate change is making in the lives of people and on the human rights of the people, it was then that people started getting sensitized and start getting the understanding of the violations of human rights are actually connected with the impact, with the consequences of climate change. So it has the journey so far has been full of challenges in terms of convincing people, in terms of spreading the awareness, in terms of taking them on board, engaging them, especially especially people working at influential positions, especially people who are at positions where they can make the decisions, where they can allocate budgets and proper funding, and they can influence the policy. So, but I wouldn't say it has just been full of challenges. It has been interesting. It has been fulfilling as well at the same time. And I believe that by now we have been able to achieve our objectives, especially in terms of establishing this connection before people and putting forward this idea that climate change is not just an issue that's a threat and it's apparent and it's obvious, but it is connected with so many other issues, so many other ideas, so many other subjects within social sciences, wherein our focus especially being on human rights. We've talked about how schools and the teaching has been affected by floods, for instance. We've talked about how gender-based violence and domestic violence has increased in the areas that have been hit by floods. So, all of these cases or all of these instances reflect violations of human rights and the inequality that already exists within the society. So, when we say that climate change exacerbates the already existing inequality, we certainly mean that it highlights the misogyny, it highlights the extremism, it highlights the discrimination that already exists within the society. And all of these, again, coming back to my initial point, reflect human rights violations, and they actually mean human rights violations are happening. So, the idea of connecting human rights with climate change and looking at the problem of climate change from a human rights perspective was our motivation, and I believe that this motivation has come a long way, and we've been able to achieve our sort of objectives and our what we what we were looking for, especially in the context of Pakistan.
When COVID came, I remember that the domestic violence was raised badly, and now you are saying that climate crisis is also affecting the quality of relationships. So it's very interesting to know. And so tell us that about your campaign that you have been doing. You were telling me that you have been raising awareness among your fraternity, among your colleagues, and there was a campaign that you launched within the Lahore High Court. So what was the motive behind that?
Thank you so much, Faria, for this question. So the campaign that we launched, it's called Informed Response to Climate Crisis, and the motivation behind it was that we as citizens of Pakistan, or we as people, as human beings, we demand or we expect not just a response to climate crisis, because we were looking at a lot of responsive measures in terms of planting trees, in terms of encouraging people to use cut down the use of their vehicles, to control the smog and stuff. I'm not saying all of these measures are not necessary or they're not important. They're equally important, but at the same time, are they enough? So our motivation at CBDR, at Capacity Building Development and Research Circle, was that we just don't need the response to climate crisis, but we need an informed response. We need a response that has been informed, that has been motivated, that has been backed by evidence, that has been backed by data, that has this element of various nuances and various cross-cutting perspectives when we talk about the issue of climate change. So, as rightly pointed out by Hugh, in COVID, for instance, or in any other natural disaster situations, the existing inequality is exacerbated. It increases. Same happens with the climate change as well. There's an interesting study of Bangladesh that has recently been published, in which the flood affected areas were studied, and it was seen that in the areas that have been hit by floods and people moved from their original locations, so there, number one, risk of child marriages increased, number of child marriages also increased, domestic violence increased massively. There's data that supports these whatever I'm saying. So such studies need to come up from Pakistan as well. So we need to have a gender lens. We need to have a human rights lens while studying the impacts of climate change as well. However, generally, when we study the impacts of climate change, we see that okay, this much number of people were relocated, this much number of schools were destroyed, this number, this much of crops were destroyed. So yes, that's important, of course, and we actually faced massive losses in 2022 floods. But beyond that, there's so many other ways to look at the impact. So there are certain visible consequences or visible destruction, and then there's so much invisible destruction, there's so much invisible impact that exists in terms of such offenses and crimes and social dynamics changing and economic situations changing. So the motivation for this campaign was that we should respond to climate change, and the response should be informed. It should not just be the response that there's flood and we have to do something, so let's just do the study and see how many crops have been destroyed. I mean, that's important. Certainly food security is a huge issue as well, but our focus mostly was on the violence perspective and gender equality and other social factors and dynamics that have changed or that have been impacted by climate change.
So, Waiza, you have raised a very important point, which I have never heard from anybody. Of course, you being an advocate of human rights, and you often talk about human rights. You have your non-profit that works, especially for gender-based violence. So, Waiza, whenever there is a catastrophe, there is always a vulnerable group that's going to get affect the most. For example, pregnant women, small children, transgender community, religious minorities, and you rightly pointed out that these vulnerable or marginalized groups uh, get most affected by the climate crisis as well. And when COVID came, we observed that toxicity among the relationships was raised, gender-based violence was raised. So, what do you think? What measures should be taken? What sustainable development measures should be taken to curb and combat this phenomena particularly? And what is your message to the international community? Because when there is a climate crisis, so we see that there are specific companies, organization, or corporate groups that support. For example, United Nations support climate hit areas, but we forget about the human rights issues. So, what's your message to the international community? How should they financially support the private household? Like, for example, you raised a point that when in Bangladesh, when there was flooding, child marriages, the cases of child marriages were increased.
Thank you so much, Faria. This is such an important question, and I think this will sum up the entire message that we at CBTR want to put out there. So, whenever we talk about the damage or destruction caused by any disasters, particularly we're talking about climate change now, but as you mentioned, COVID also, COVID was not a climate related issue, but it was a disaster. So, in disasters, as I said earlier, the inequality is exacerbated. The inequality that already exists in society is multiplied. So, for instance, women are vulnerable in Pakistani society. Children are vulnerable, transgender community is vulnerable, religious minorities are vulnerable, so their vulnerabilities actually multiply whenever there is a disaster, whenever there is a crisis situation. Talking about the climate change, when Pakistan faced floods, there were many initiatives and there were different packages in relief and reconstruction and welfare schemes going on in order to, compensate the people affected by flood, but we did not see any preferential or any special measures taken to uplift women, any special measures to uplift transgender community. Nobody was voicing as such for religious minorities. So this is the point that the focus should not be on a very generic basis. We should not be aiming to solve the problem or to rebuild on a general basis. We need to look at issues from different perspectives, and we need to look at issues from specific perspectives as well. So I believe that the existing discrimination against women, against transgender persons, against religious minorities for that matter, increases whenever there's any crisis situation. So, what happens as a consequence of that is when we talk about building or implementing solutions, we do not quantify this invisible damage. We do not quantify and include this damage in our damages that we read. So there's a problem with data collection. There's a problem because we are not reading that data, we are not picking on those problems, and we are not including those problems because we do not see it as destruction. So eventually when we speak about our destruction or damages in front of the international community for financing or for aids, half of the issues are already neglected, half of the issues are not included. We talk about destroyed crops and infrastructure, and we get aid, and we get support from people around the world in order to rebuild that. But what about the issues that you've mentioned, for instance domestic violence, for instance gender based violence, complete neglect of transgender community? We don't include their issues as well, we don't include their destruction, their damages. So that is why it is important to look at climate change not just in terms of physical damage, but we need to look at it from a human rights perspective, and we need to add more, specificity when we look at the issue, and when we try to resolve those issues and rebuild from scratch.
So, Waiza, you being an advocate and a practicing lawyer, what do you think? What steps should be taken on constitutional level?
On a constitutional level, I would assume what role the constitutional courts can play when it comes to the impact or appropriate response to the impact of climate change, especially floods. So I think that the courts in Pakistan, the constitutional courts, including the high courts and supreme courts, have been proactive, and we've had and we still have some really amazing jurists on the bench that have been very actively advocating for climate justice, and they've been trying to promote the discourse with respect to climate justice in Pakistan, and they've been playing this role very actively through their judgments. I think if we continue with that, this is certainly going to achieve the objectives, and we will, finally be able to achieve climate justice in one way or the other. But at the same time, I think that it is not just the constitutional court's job to talk about climate change and to ensure climate justice. It is more related to policymakers, lawmakers. It is more related to the government and the laws and the initiatives and the policy decisions that they are taking. So, to the policymakers and to the to the government, I would really say that there is a huge financing gap between the impact or the destruction that has already been brought and the uh, sorry there's a huge financing gap between the problems that have occurred due to climate change, and those problems, if we really need to solve them and if we really need to rebuild, as our government claims, we need to put in much more money, and the international community especially is not putting in as much as the destruction has already taken place, because the losses are, as I've mentioned earlier, are not just visible losses, but the losses have occurred in layers and layers, and a lot of them are invisible as well. For instance, the factors and the social changes that I'm referring to. So I believe that the financing should be appropriate and proportionate. My emphasis is on proportionate financing to rebuild Pakistan, to reconstruct everything that has been destructed, and it's just not building the infrastructure again, but it relates to the education, the time that has been lost, the children that have been out of school, violence cases that have arisen, and training of the law enforcement agencies and departments that can play a role in ensuring justice and peace in those affected areas.
Thank you so much, Waiza. Waiza raised a very valid point. She said that there is a huge financial gap. If you remember, in our last talk with environmental lawyer Rafi Alam, he pointed out the same point that our vulnerability is that we are a poor country and we need reparational justice from rich polluters who have polluted world, our earth with industrialization and by promoting fossil fuels. We need justice from them, and especially the vulnerable and poor countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and so on. Thank you so much.